want to give is about from API craftsmanship to API landscaping. And what I want to talk about is this trend that Bill also mentioned, that we're seeing APIs becoming more and more prevalent and more popular and more used throughout organizations. So the question is, how do you actually get to the point where you use them with more confidence in a more systematic way, in a way that is more reproducible and just becomes what you're doing? Okay, very briefly, on the next slide, to wake you up, I have hidden a very subtle hint about my Twitter handle. I don't know whether you can spot it. If you go to my Twitter timeline, what you will see is my last tweet actually has a link to the slides. So if you want to look at the slides, they're online. You can just follow now, or you can bookmark them for later. And what I usually try to do is put some links into my presentations so that they point to interesting resources. So if you want to look at the slides, just go to my timeline. Okay, very briefly an introduction about myself. So I'm from API Academy, and the reason I jumped into this slot is actually because one of my colleagues, Mehdi Medjoui, he didn't make it. I think he's on the train right now, I guess. So he got delayed on his way here, and therefore I'm taking his spot, or taking this opportunity. We're a very small team. There's pretty much 5 of us doing what I'm doing here now. So we travel quite literally the world and talk about APIs. And our goal is to really help organizations to better understand APIs, use them in a better way, in a more systematic way, and of course, in the end, also we're employed in the end by CA, so we're part of CA Technologies, but we're a special team in the sense that we never talk about products, we don't try to sell products, we really try to help organizations to use APIs in a better way, in a more predictable way, in a more reliable way, so that in the end they will just use more APIs. And if they do that, in the end, that'll translate to more general business in the API space, and hopefully also some of that business will go our way. Right, so that's the theory there. And there's 5 of us. There's Matt in Vancouver. There's Mike and Munson in Cincinnati. There's Mehdi, who was originally planned as a speaker. There's Ronnie, who's also somewhere around here, and myself. And we do these engagements because we want to spread the word, but we also spend a lot of time with clients and customers who are working in the API space, right? Who approach us and ask us, help us along the way. We're having problems, or we want to do this, we're not quite sure how. So we actually talk to a lot of companies, and it's very interesting to just see what they're saying, what they're experiencing, and that's mostly what I want to do today, is talk to you a little bit about our experiences, what we see, and maybe that is also interesting for you to take with you and think about when you are planning on using APIs, you want to use more APIs or do it in a better way, one of those things. And as part of our general outreach, what we also do is we write. So we write blogs and articles, standards, and we also write books. So this one actually isn't out yet. We just this weekend, on Sunday, we turned in the final copy-edit versions. So what we've seen, and this is what this talk mainly will be about, is that one of the big challenges that organizations have is to scale their API practice, right? Just doing APIs by now is probably something where a lot of people have some experience, some teams have some experience, so that's not the hard part. The hard part is more, how do you actually scale that when you have hundreds or thousands of APIs, which is very normal in big organizations, right? That you are effective at managing your APIs, so that this just becomes a continuous practice in your organization. And that, because we thought that this particular aspect is not really covered quite as much, maybe, as it should be, we set out to write this book, and that is our latest sort of incarnation of how we try to follow the space and sort of bring back to the community a little bit of what we see when we do our work. So one of the things I want to talk about, the thing I want to start with, is digital transformation is a topic that is very common, right? You hear that mentioning all the time, and it's not really kind of a very original thought, right? So when you go to an organization, a big one, typically nowadays, somebody will always talk about digital transformation, right? That's what we do now. And you're just like, yeah, sure, everybody's doing that. So in part, right, you could probably come up with some kind of generic digital transformation vision that you can apply to pretty much everybody. This is my version, and I'll read it to you because I'm proud. Our digital transformation initiative will turn us into the leader of the industry by allowing us to interact with our customers more easily and more frequently. By increasing the number of customer touchpoints and using the resulting feedback to quickly and relentlessly adapt and improve our offerings, we will be able to outperform our competition and turn into the market leader within the next 3 years. My next goal is actually to turn that into a little form where you can plug in your own little numbers, like do we outperform the market in 3, 4, or 5 years? But the interesting part to me really is when somebody says that to us, right? And inevitably, somebody will. Usually what I say is, that's good, probably. Now tell me more. How are you actually doing that? Right? And that, I think, is sometimes the part where people lack basically on execution. Right? So the vision is clear, but how do you actually do that? And at that point, I think sometimes it becomes something almost scary. It's like this, we know we have to do it, everybody else is doing it, if we don't do it, we're doomed, so let's say we're doing it, right? And like I said, we literally travel the globe, so I try to strike fear in people wherever I go. This is from my travels, kind of the same slide. I had no idea what's scary in Sweden, so I didn't make a slide for here. So this one, top left is Japan. The middle top was Australia. Top right is Western US. Bottom left is Europe. That is South America, and then South Africa. So digital transformation is scary everywhere. And what we try to do is really to help people kind of tell them how they can actually do it, right? And I think there's two kind of axes or two areas that are really important, and one of them is probably more focused on than the other one. And one of them, I think, is like the focus on APIs, which here is the horizontal thing where you say from this digital transformation idea, you have this hopefully relatively clear idea of what digital transformation actually means, and it's not just APIs, but without APIs, you're kind of missing a really important ingredient. Right? And we actually see that. I mean, you go to organizations where you hear about digital transformation and you ask them, what's your API strategy? And they don't have one. And that's really confusing to me. It's like, without APIs, it's kind of hard, right? So that's, I think, more commonly known, not always done, but more commonly known. But there's also this aspect of scaling things, right? Not just talking about APIs and saying that without APIs, digital transformation is a really hard thing to do, but also how do you scale it, right? How does that become a practice where your teams know this is the direction we're going, they believe in it, they practice it, they contribute to it, and you're also providing them with the right support so that they can do their work effectively, and you help them to add to this landscape of digitally transformed capabilities that hopefully come into being, right? And sometimes I think it's that fear, so to speak, or that challenge that you have this vision and then thinking about how do I turn it into a reality. And it's kind of a little bit like this. This is actually me. So this is the Grand Canyon, and like a couple of years ago, we had this idea, we want to run across the Grand Canyon. And it was kind of the same thing, right? You have this vision of, that would be really cool. But then you get there and you're starting to think about, A, was that a very good idea? And B, how do you actually do it, right? And C, if something goes wrong along the way, how do you notice? How do you deal with it? So that eventually you make it safe to your destination. And I think in some ways, right, we're just asking the very same thing for sort of the API strategy part. It's not just tell us about digital transformation, but just tell me how you plan to get there, how you will check along the way that you're actually doing fine, what are your indicators to help you assess your progress, and how are you able to correct course when things are not going well, all these kind of things, right? And sometimes I think there is that gap in there, and it is interesting to see or to think about why that happens, and also to try to help sometimes a little bit with filling in that gap. Right. And to some extent, I mean, that's a little minimalistic, I guess, but you could say that actually leadership isn't that hard. Right? I think it is. But you could say, basically, what you need to do is you come up with a vision, but you also come up with a plan how to implement that vision, right? So you have a strategy, how you allocate resources, why you're doing that, how you're sort of deciding between the different investments you have to make. And you also come up with a plan of how to measure progress while you're actually doing it, so that you can reallocate resources or you can adjust course while you're trying to get to your destination, right? So, I mean, at that level, of course, it's a little bit simplistic. But like I said, sometimes you can really look at organizations and you say, they're not even doing that. And I don't want to say this is easy. I think that actually is not that easy. If you're a big organization and you come from a very different place, putting this into place and executing it is not an easy job, right? But it's what you have to do, I believe, if you really want to succeed along your way of having more APIs, using them in a productive way, and using them in the end to provide value, to improve your organization, right? Because that's what we want to do. And one of the concepts that we talk about in our book, which I like because we've seen that a fair bit, is what we call API archaeology. So if you go to an organization that, let's say, is not very far along their travel towards APIs, and you talk to them, then actually in pretty much in all cases, right, you do figure out that of course they have APIs, right? They have connected systems to talk to each other, because that's what everybody has to do nowadays. It's just not technically what maybe nowadays we would call an API. It's more like point-to-point integrations, and it's kind of expensive to set up, and it's kind of brittle. So once you've done that, you never want to touch it again, right? And when that person who did it leaves the company, you're doomed because nobody knows how it works. But that's kind of the first, like the proto-API stage, right? You have to connect systems, so you did it. But nowadays we know better, right? So the idea would be learning from that, using sort of this understanding of where you have communicating systems in your organization, and using that to have a starting point, understanding clearly this provided value because somebody did it, right? So maybe that's a good starting point, or that's a good thing to keep in mind, that if we ever get to it, or if we ever have to do it, that might be a good place where we can modernize and use APIs that are better documented, potentially reusable, maybe can be extended over time without everybody having to change things, right? So in the end, I think you could say that, I mean, APIs aren't that revolutionary, right? We have connected computer systems for many decades now, but they have like some additional constraints to it, right? But easing your way into it, maybe looking at what you're actually doing already, and then using that as a starting point, sometimes also, I think, is a good opportunity to not see it as quite as intimidating, and instead say, yeah, we've been doing that. Now we're just doing it in a better way. Right? And once you go down that path of trying to become more productive, more professional, more systematic in having APIs, defining APIs, implementing APIs, there's several ways how you can help. And one of the things that you see in many organizations that have APIs is that they have this supporting infrastructure, this supporting group that at a very high level is in charge of basically the API strategy, right? They help with APIs, they distribute the knowledge across teams and help them to know what's going on, to help them with practices, help them with what standards are we using, help them with maybe tooling, right? If you're using this, then we have a tool here, so it makes it easy for you. So trying to solve problems that are occurring over and over and make teams more productive, right? And the magic there is to still give teams a lot of autonomy and say, you do what you have to do, but if you do it in a certain way, we can help you to do your job faster, right? We have some piece of infrastructure here. Like if you have to secure your APIs, you don't have to implement security yourself because that would be insane, but you can use our tooling and just get it done. Right? So the team can focus on the business problem that creates value, and you do something that actually makes the team more effective. That's kind of the magic that you want to achieve, right? This balance of giving teams autonomy, but also making them more effective by giving them support. And in more cases, what you see is that you have in large organizations these guidelines for APIs that are created. Right? And what we recommend is structuring those guidelines in a very clear way that for everything that you establish as a guideline, you say why this guideline exists. Right? If you have trouble writing up why it exists, it probably shouldn't exist. Telling teams what to do when they want to address that. And then also giving teams at least one option how to actually do it. Right? And tell them, well, if you want to do it, here's a way how we can help you, or here's a tool you can use, or here's a standard that you can base on. Right? That way, what you do is you help teams to understand what they're supposed to build. You also help them to understand how they can expect support, but you still give them freedom to maybe provide new ways of doing it. So when they come up with suggestions and say, oh, we found a better way of solving that problem, you should actually revise the guidelines and say, oh, we have a better solution now. Right? So your guidelines actually evolve over time. They're a living document and not sort of, it's not like you show up, right, with the 2 clay tablets and say, here are the guidelines, folks. Right? They actually, you're the one editing them. That's the main point there. And you're trying to use them as a foundation for helping API teams. And as one way of kind of informing your thinking in that space, like what are the important factors that should come into play, we identified a variety of aspects where we think they matter for the landscapes. And these are just meant as kind of guidance that tell you, you should think about that aspect. It's important, and whatever you're doing in that space, look at how it fits into this overall picture. So we talk about variety and say, in API landscapes, right, you should allow variety. It probably doesn't make any sense in bigger landscapes to tell everybody to solve a problem in one way. Right? They have to solve a specific problem, so maybe the solution that you have in mind is not the best solution for them. So don't build something that kind of is a monoculture. Right? Allow variety and allow teams to come up with new solutions to existing problems. So, for example, that maybe over time, which seems to happen right now, right? Maybe at least parts of the organization can pivot from REST APIs to GraphQL because that seems to be the new thing that people like. So now you start doing this, right? But you're still doing REST and maybe something else, depending on who the consumers are and what they prefer. Second thing is vocabularies, right? So APIs, the way I usually talk about it, APIs are languages, right? An API is a language how 2 peers can exchange information about a capability. Usually I request something and then the capability tells me okay or not good, something like this, right? And when designing those languages, sometimes parts of those languages actually can reuse certain vocabularies. A common example would be error messages. Right? If you design an API, do you always have to design your own model how an error message is being produced and formatted? You could, but it's probably not the most helpful way to do it. So instead of that, just use one vocabulary. There's a standard for it. Everybody uses that. They don't have to spend time designing it. Again, that should be something where that vocabulary then can be shared across the landscape. The third is volume. So sometimes we have organizations that are noticeably worried about, we will have too many APIs, right? Where you say, like, it should be the opposite, right? You say, we want to have a lot of APIs, right? That should be your goal. So don't let the fear of volume, so to speak, reduce the number of APIs that you want to have. You want to have an ecosystem where APIs come up, consumers come up, and some APIs will die because nobody uses them, and others will flourish because they're popular and well-designed. And you want to allow that ecosystem, and you want to allow that dynamic, because you don't know ahead which API will be successful and which API will not be successful. So allow many of those to come into existence. Don't try to reduce the volume artificially, and then just let basically nature play its course, right? So kind of natural selection in your API landscape. Velocity is another important thing. One of the reasons why people go through this whole exercise is they want to publish reusable things that can be used by many users, right? And then one of the problems kind of is now, once you have that, you have one capability and many users. How do you coordinate changes, right? If that thing changes, does everybody else have to change? If you want to change if you have a lot of users, do you need to somehow adjust your capability? So ideally, right, you want those changes in the ecosystem to be loosely or decoupled, right? In the sense that if somebody changes the API, that doesn't mean everybody else has to make the same changes, right? So the velocity means that every part of it, of your API ecosystem, of APIs and consumers, can change at whatever pace it wants to change without you saying, no, we cannot do this because if we do it over here, this breaks and then that breaks, so we can only do it next year, right? So that's the part that you want to avoid. The third part is vulnerability. So every API is a potential security problem, right? So that's another thing that you really want to keep an eye on to make sure that whoever is doing APIs in your ecosystem are doing it in a responsible way so that you don't have to worry about all those APIs popping up, right? Where from a security standpoint, sometimes people think that, that's kind of a problem. Now we have 1,000 APIs, so basically we have 1,000 potential security problems. So you want to have like a robust strategy around that, right? That covers it and helps people to actually deal with that. Visibility is another important aspect. By now, there's whole conferences around API portals and these kind of things, right? How do you allow people to even figure out what kind of APIs exist? There's a little spectrum there depending on who the APIs are for, whether they're for internal use only or you expose them to partners or you expose them to the public, right? Sometimes there's sort of a different level of investment, how easily you want to make them discoverable and how polished you want to make them appear. But you definitely want to make sure that somehow the people looking for capabilities in APIs can find them, right? So, and again, this sometimes conflicts with volume and all these velocity, right? So if all I have is snapshots that I take every year, that's not so great. So it's probably better if you really have sort of a plan for how to make APIs visible that is scalable and is able to follow along while your APIs change and all these things, right? So, but it's an important thing to keep in mind that if you have lots of APIs, you want to make them visible. Another important aspect to keep in mind is versioning. So this idea that you want to evolve the APIs because based on feedback, you can improve products. So you want to be able to do that. How do you do this? So probably one of the things that you want to establish in your API teams is acknowledging the fact that they will change their APIs. They should be encouraged to do that, but also help them to do it in a responsible way, right? So that they don't break the consumers all the time, but instead you have design practices that allow you to improve APIs without breaking existing consumers. And that's not that hard to do. You just have to make sure that people know how to do it and that this becomes an aspect that you're actually enforcing or encouraging, whatever your favorite term is, right, when teams come up with APIs. And the last one that we have is volatility, and that sometimes is tricky. So volatility is about the fact that if you have APIs, in many cases, you have a decentralized landscape. You might have microservices with lots of things running in many different places, and that also means they can disappear, right? You might have operational problems here, here, here. So using them should become something where you're always prepared that this API may not actually work, right? It should, maybe, but it may not. So using APIs also becomes this exercise in sort of distributed computing where you should not make the assumption that everything is always up and running, right? If you do that, your software is not very resilient because as soon as one tiny piece starts having problems, your software starts having problems. And that's not necessarily the thing that you want to do. And that becomes particularly important, for example, if you do things such as SDKs, right? If you give people SDKs, then that's your code running at their locations in their clients. And if your SDK is not handling an API problem responsibly, right, it may just crash or hang or do bad things, where instead, if it were well designed, it could just do something responsible and say, hey, I'm trying to do this, I can't because the service doesn't seem to be up, but at least it's something well defined that happens, right? So again, it's a design thing to keep in mind that with APIs, you have a decentralized landscape. In decentralized landscapes, things can go wrong in all kinds of places and funky ways. Always keep that in mind, right? And also build a testing structure where if you test, you also test for situations where some of your APIs that you're using are actually not there or are super slow or doing these kind of things, right? Does your code still behave as well as it can under these circumstances? It should, right? If it doesn't, again, you're just not taking full advantage of what you're building. And when you go through all these guidelines, in the end, I think what you want to do is you want to build up capabilities and competence throughout your organization where people use tools in a good way. And they come up with good tools, maybe, that you don't know. So what you want to avoid, and that's the Maslow's hammer, right? For those of you who don't know Maslow's hammer, the saying goes, if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail, right? That's what you want to avoid. So what you want to do is all the teams working on APIs, you want to maybe give them a couple of tools, but you also want to tell them, if you come up with a better solution of approaching this problem, that's fine, that's great. Tell me, and we will add it basically to our tool set that Bill was mentioning, right? Like this big wall where you have all your API tools hanging, right? We will just put one more there and say, hey, for this problem, now we also have this tool, right? Anybody interested can use it. So, and I want to close with a very, very brief technical remark, so to speak. Now, one of the tricks when you do all of this is also to think about, now, how can I build this growing body of knowledge in a way that I can constantly evolve it without having to re-engineer all my APIs all the time? And there's this wonderful kind of new idea emerging that I really love, which is called continuous architecting. So the idea of continuous architecting is to say interfaces sometimes are remarkably stable, right? So that's an interface, that's a user interface for a driving thing, right? That's about 100 years old. And since I'm German, I'm required by law to show you a picture of a fast German car. Here it is, right? And the remarkable thing is the interface is pretty close, right? The steering wheel is still there. I guess in this one, it's not even hydraulic, it's electrical, right? So the implementation totally changed, but the interface is still the same, meaning that with enough design effort and enough purpose to make users happy and successful, you can actually evolve systems and evolve implementations without disrupting the interface experience so much, right? And the idea of continuous architecting really is to say, we know that a year and 2 years and 3 years from now, we know more about how to do good APIs and how to implement APIs. But we also know that we cannot go back and redo everything we're doing now. So what we're trying to do is really to always build the best API that we can build at that point in time. Build in extensibility, right? We have a couple more like little knobs here and there that we didn't have before. But by and large, all the products that we have kind of look and feel in a similar way, right? And that, I think, is kind of the secret sauce, basically, of how to actually be the steward of these guidelines and evolve them over time so that you can enable your teams to be better designers and implementers. And with that, I would like to finish. My closing remark for all of this is really to tell you that what we see is really that companies are moving towards this idea of trying to embrace or trying to establish this culture of building ecosystems and not so much systems anymore, right? More decoupled things, individual developments, DevOps, right? Like make everybody faster. And one of the things that I have observed from my personal view is that I think the difference between systems and ecosystems is that like systems are actually, I think, easier to build, but harder to maintain over time or harder to change. Let's put it like this. Ecosystems are harder to design, but then they are easier to change, right? So, and I think that is sometimes the part where it becomes tricky because you have to make this upfront investment into, I know that it's a harder design work to start with an ecosystem, but I want to do it because I'm in it for the long haul and for the long-term gains, right? And I think this is where API strategies and API plans and all those things come into place. And in the end, APIs, I think, really play a crucial role there, right? My saying, so when I worked at universities for a long time. When I worked at the university, my door sign said web plumber, and I was proud of that, right? And I think with APIs, actually, I mean, it doesn't really sound very sexy, I guess, but APIs are the same thing, right? They're just plumbing. And if you look at plumbing, right, it's the same kind of thing. You never buy a house because it has great plumbing, right? You wouldn't go to a house and say, oh, I really like this house, great plumbing, right? You look at other things. But if a house has really bad plumbing, right, that's like you wouldn't, no matter how nicely it is, right, you would say, like, no, I don't want a house with bad plumbing. And APIs, I think, are the same thing. They're essential, right? For digital transformation, if you don't have a good API plan, you're not really realizing the full potential. They're not everything you need to do, but they're one of the important things. Okay, and with that, I would like to end. Thank you very much. Once again, the slides are online. If you want to find them, follow this link or follow me on Twitter. Thanks very much for the opportunity for being here. I'm almost not over time, so thanks again. And I think next up is Travis, you will do the honors, right? Okay, thanks.